Hello and welcome to my channel. For this video I'm going to take you back to February of 2020, which is a year you should all be very familiar with. So I started making a mask of a little known Star Wars character called Prune. He can be briefly seen in a couple of scenes in Return of the Jedi. So I built up the basic shapes out of upholstery foam before covering the top layer with a thin sheet of foam and smoothing it out. And this was the first step completed. It's a pretty fellow, isn't it? After checking the reference material again, I noticed some of the proportions are off. So I went ahead and applied some further trims. It's starting to look a little bit gnarly, but that's not to worry, because slowly but surely I start adding on some foam clay as the top layer. This will set solid and I'll be able to carve it later. So everything was going well until we got into early March, and you know what happened? The world went into lockdown and I got very poorly. So Prune sat on the shelf for many years just gathering dust. Then I started a YouTube channel while I recovered, except that recovery was only partial and now I'm not allowed to wear masks. So I've decided to continue this build and make it a display piece only. But first I need to go back to the source material and do some research again. And this Star Wars costume book was absolutely perfect for this, as there are very few reference photos available for this character. I've clearly got a lot of work ahead of me, but at least I've got the groundwork laid. Using a black marker, the first step is to mark out all the creases and wrinkles. These are predominantly on the front of the face and on the forehead. And then with my new cordless rotary tool, I select a fine bit and carve out the details. It doesn't matter if I slip and make any mistakes, because I have loads of areas which need filling in anyway. Afterwards I go over the grooves with the circular file. This smooths everything out and I've got greater control as it's not spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. Since this is no longer going to be a mask, I can plug up the eye holes. The eyes on this guy are quite large, so I cut them out of some high density 5mm foam, and then using the Dremel I round out the edges. To give it a curve, I heat it up with a heat gun and then I use the back of a dish to round it out, and as it cools down it will maintain its shape. The heat also closes the pores and seals it. We don't need to worry about the edges, as the eyelids will cover those. Before we glue anything down, it's always a good idea to test fit everything, and the sizes look about right to me. My glue of choice is contact cement. This is put on both halves and left to dry, so when you do touch them together they will bond instantly. So it's best to make sure you've got a good aim and don't miss. That covers the now defunct eye hole, and I repeat the same process with the other side. I then carved out the raised area which goes around the eye, and after smoothing out the edges also stick them into place, and then it's time to break out the foam clay again and crack on with some sculpting. And these little packets from Hobbycraft are ideal for small projects or for touch-up work, which is what I'm using it for. So this character has some ridges which go across the centre of his forehead, and using a wet finger this stuff blends in easily to the older stuff. Next I need to pad out the eye area so they're not so pronounced. Plus I also add in some crease lines with a sculpting tool. Since there are loads of cracks and blemishes in the old clay, they need filling in, and just by adding water to the clay it can be thinned right down and blend in. You will always be left with a slight edge, but hopefully that will disappear with the paint job. And this is how it's looking so far. I'm going to leave it overnight to fully cure. There are still some problems with it, but it's starting to look a lot more like the character now, or at least another one of its species. The head hole has always bothered me because it's so untidy. Fixing that turned out to be quite easy. Using contact cement, I wrap around several strips of 1mm thick foam. Eventually all the unsightly edges are covered and it looks more like a helmet. There are still plenty of blemishes to get rid of, and for that I use standard model filler and blend it in. Luckily this guy is called Prune, so some blemishes are excusable. So once the putty is dried I can sand that down. I use the rotary tool for the prominent areas and a sanding sponge and a sanding stick for the rest. And once I'm fairly happy with that I can start painting. Now it needs priming first, so I'm going to add on a few layers of acrylic paint. I have loads of this low pigmented stuff which needs using up. If I can get it thick enough, it will help to fill in some of the remaining crevices, and hopefully after I've applied the final layer it should all be opaque. Just by having it one uniform colour makes it look so much better, even though white is technically not a colour. Anyway, I give it a light sanding to smooth it down a bit more. Then I apply a layer of the good white paint with a sponge. By dabbing on the paint I don't get any brush strokes and it creates a natural texture. And slowly but surely the whole thing is covered. The finished colour for this guy should be like a bronze browny colour. So I start off by dabbing on a muddy brown as a base colour, and I will apply progressively lighter colours on top of this. This process will create a mottled, uneven coverage, which in the end will create a much more natural skin tone rather than a flat colour. As you can see, I've now progressed to a lighter tone for the top layer. This effect is better achieved with an airbrush if you've got one, but they do require a lot of maintenance. Next, I painted in some brown into all the creases. Then I diluted the same paint to put into all the low areas, and this gives me all my shadows, although the effect is not that noticeable under studio light. I added a red wash to the lips, before dry brushing on some flesh tones for the highlights. You can buy these big makeup brushes quite cheap and they're very effective for this process. Before finally coating the whole thing with some watered down brown shoe polish. This will help to protect the paint and to help make the skin look a little bit leathery. For the eyes I painted them a warm yellow, and as per usual yellow requires multiple coats. Then I mixed in a little bit of orange and painted around the edges, and then using a clean brush and a little bit of water I blend those in, keeping the darker areas to the edges and the lighter spots in the middle. For the pupil I figured it would be easier using a black sharpie, as I have a lot more control than a brush. Eyes are meant to be shiny, so I add a gloss varnish, and this helps to bring it to life. Even though the left eye is going to be behind a patch, it's nice to have the option to remove it. And speaking of the patch, I picked up some leather cord. There's no reference pictures of how this sits at the back of the head, and after a bit of trial and error I learned that it had to kind of sit on top. So I wrap it around, cut it to size and glue the ends together. Then I make the eye patch pretty much the same way as I made the eyes, and these are out of foam because I didn't have any leather to hand. The edges needed smoothing out and rounding down. Then I gave it a blast with a heat gun so I'll create a curve, and this is done by pressing it against a rounded ball until it cools, and that way it should wrap comfortably around the eye. There's an inset around the edge which will grind down with my rotary tool, and to help create the leather effect I need to make a few creases, and that's easily done by pressing on a sculpting tool in various places. The cord where the overlap is simply glued on the inside of the eye patch, that way it will look nice and neat. Now when this was going to be a mask, this eye patch was going to be hollow and covered with a mesh, that way I would have still been able to see out of it once I block up the other eye hole. The eye patch still doesn't look leathery enough, so I'll cover it with some black paint, and this will give it a bit of a sheen. I've had to raid my box of greeblies for some technical parts. These are mostly parts belonging to an old R2-D2 model kit. They are not identical to the ones used in the source material, but they are along the same line, and these belong to both sides of the eye patch. I have no idea what function they're supposed to serve, but I guess we'll leave that up to our imaginations. And once it's all assembled, we can pop it in place. And this for me really does bring the character to life. Right, I think it's time to check out Prune Face in all its glory. The only problem is it's too big for my workbench, so we're going to have to move into the hallway. So it's been a bit of a labour of love getting this guy completed, and it also helped me to close the book on a not very nice chapter of my life. I'm also wondering how many people actually know this character. I had this toy as a kid, but not knowing where he was in the movie. Eventually I found him, as he's only in two very small scenes. In the first one is amongst the crowd in a briefing room, and on the second is amongst the troops on Endor. I did also start prepping another mask from another film at this time, but I didn't get very far with it at all, so there may be another project coming soon. And the creature was Darkness from Legend. Thank you for watching. Don't forget, if I can do it, so can you.